live. So
Thank
happy
you,
to
Chris.
speak with you today.
We're all dying to leave on
So,
some level, I suppose, metaphysically.
yes, thanks for that. Speaking of, have you seen the new Netflix show about death that just came out?
Is it the no, I don't think I have. I've been hearing about this Disney Plus movie called Soul, and that I need to see that, but I have not heard about the Netflix show. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I haven't seen Soul either, but it's on my list. I just started the Netflix show last night, and it's all about different aspects of death and death culture. So the first episode was on near-death experiences,
Hmm.
and the second one was about mediums and spirits and things like that. It's speaking of leaving here. It was really interesting.
Well, thank you. I'll check it out.
Yeah. So how are you today?
I'm doing pretty well, especially like I was saying before we began here. Now that the gardener seems to be done with the leaf blower, which I was afraid was going to consume the audio of this particular podcast. It always happens when something like that. It's like, what's the law that when that the thing that whatever it is. Anyway,
Murphy's Law?
yeah. I'm just happy to be here with you right at the moment.
Oh, excellent. Me too. Well, I'm really intrigued by your story, which I'd love to bring others into, of course. But I wanted to kind of start with one of your concepts that I love, which is about the false ego, because I have something kind of similar that I talk about a lot, which is your life prescription, kind of what you grew up into, how you're supposed to be, what life is supposed to be, and the realization most of us don't make until we have to, that we actually have a choice to construct our lives in the
Yeah.
exact way that we want.
Yes, well said. Well said. Yeah, I love that we're just diving right in deep here, right off the bat, because this is the type of stuff that I love to talk about. Yeah, it's we take for granted where these stories, where these narratives, where these beliefs come from, and I have vivid memories of childhood when before I sort of developed my belief systems about myself and my beliefs about the world. And these vivid memories that I have were of an experience of when I think back, it's like Technicolor. It's like life was just breathing with possibility, and everything was occurring spontaneously in the moment, and everything was exactly what I made of it. And then I found that both for myself and for everyone that I knew, as we quote unquote grew up, and I'm using air quotes there, as we grew up, it's really like a calcification around a certain type of identity that we learn from our family and we learn from our culture. And it unconsciously starts to just settle in, and we start to take for granted the way in which we begin to think that separates us from that sort of field of possibility, if you will. And my whole direction in life is to recover and restore as much of that as I possibly can in myself and in the people that I interact with too, because that's where true presence really lies. And the false ego, as I see it, is the identity that's taken on to be able to navigate culture based on what we learn from our family and our friends and our colleagues and so forth. And that identity structure, it needs to go, because it's not actually it's rigid, it's never flexible, it's not dynamic, and it's not fun to exist in when you really think about it.
Yeah, I love that. Do you think that there's a point in time where we shift into that mode of adopting kind of that prescription? Is it, when we leave, childhood and get into adolescence and start having more expectations put on us by our communities and families, or how do you think that unfolds?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it happens differently for different people. And I think there's a period during one's adolescence where one is trying to sort of separate oneself from the family construct, from sort of taking on the family's identity. And that's what that typical rebellious period oftentimes entails. But in the meantime, they're also trying to adopt another identity that is sort of I remember it vividly myself, sort of rebelling against where I saw my own parents, my own family had sort of rigid patterns of belief that I didn't really feel resonated with me. But the only way that I knew how to get away from that was to sort of start to hang out with people who thought and behaved very differently in almost a sort of compensatory manner. And so I sort of started to take on the attitude and belief of that particular tribe versus actually seeing that tribe also had its own problems in terms of its own rigid identity structures as well. And so yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think it imprints everyone differently, this phenomenon. And I'm not sure if there's a particular time. Do you remember a particular time in your own life when you started to sort of separate from a greater sense of possibility?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for asking. Same kind of time frame, and it's interesting that adolescent period when you don't also necessarily, well, your brain is not fully formed, and you don't necessarily have the EQ to navigate the choices that you might make
Well
as well
said.
as you do later. So
Well said.
I can imagine that's why some folks end up with the, running with the bad crowd, also doing air quotes right now, and that kind of thing. But I would say for me, it was around that time. I remember, I may have said this in a previous podcast, I'm not sure, but I walked into the local ice cream shop and I had begun thinking, um, I grew up in a really small town. It didn't have a stoplight, and I had
Where
the
was it, if you don't mind me asking?
um, Michigan, Southeast Michigan.
Okay. Mhm.
Yeah. So tiny town. Everybody knew everybody. The town cop was also, ignore the barking dog. The town cop was also the principal of the high school. We had like a tanning salon, video rental, laundromat combo.
Mhm.
So just your quintessential small town.
It sounds very, very similar to the town that I grew up in Maine.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Same makeup, different flavors, probably.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Yeah, and I remember walking into the ice cream store and petitioning the owners to hire me, even though I was underage, even for like seasonal work, right? I was 13 and you had to be 14. They hired me anyway. And I remember thinking, if I could just save up enough money, I can see what else is out there. Cause I'm not sure that this is all there is for me. There's gotta be.
Mhm, mhm. And so did that end up happening?
I mean, I don't think I saved up my $3.25 an hour minimum wage that I made there, but I did get the job. They did hire me. I worked there all the way through high school. And then, yeah, I went on to college, and I think I spent one summer at home and then spent the rest up at school exploring what else there might be. Moved a number of different places, and then eventually moved to Seattle. So
So you did end up breaking away. It just took maybe an additional 5 years beyond when you first took your first job and had your first dream of breaking free from it.
sure. And I think it's continuous too. I think you're always doing that. So even now, you see those patterns come up. Of course, the work is never done, and you're constantly kind of looking at, ooh, how do I want to evolve now? How do I want to
Yeah.
move away from that prescription even now? Or at least I do.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting how being in a different geographical location, you can kind of see how certain attitudes and behaviors are very common in that particular geographical location. Like the types of attitudes and behaviors that I grew up in Maine were very different, like a world away from the world that I moved into when I moved to Los Angeles for, between 2001 and, until a couple of years ago. And when you can see it on the outside geographically in terms of the way in which the culture sort of creates its own type of attitudes and behaviors, then I think it's easier to see it on the inside, how we do the same thing ourselves, right?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a great way to shape that up. Even the difference between LA and Ojai, where you are now, are worlds away.
Oh yeah, they're worlds away. I mean, this is an hour and 15 minutes away from LA, and yet you would not imagine that it's anywhere near LA based on the type of typical attitude and behavior that you see here versus there. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, wow.
Hmm.
So you have gone through a number of things in your life, and my guess is that, and you do say this overtly, that you have had to make those choices for yourself, those kind of going against the life prescription or choosing to write your own, um, at least once in a major way. But my guess is over and over time, like we just talked about. And I wondered if you could, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the big one for me was when I was 24 and I had just finished cycling across the US and actually started in your town of Seattle and led a group of 9 teenagers on a transcontinental cycling trek. And we finished in New Jersey in August of 1999. And a couple of months later, 2.5 months later, in November 9th of 1999, I was in a car accident caused by a drunk driver, and I was riding in the back seat of the car that he was driving. And he went off the road and hit a tree, and I became paraplegic. And so I went from being this able-bodied athlete who was a snowboarder and skier and cyclist and hiker, and my whole world revolved around outdoor education and athletics. And suddenly I was paralyzed from the navel down and had to adapt to a whole new life after that happened. And so it's that type of trauma when it's interesting because at the time I was really resonating with Buddhist philosophy and teachings, which are primarily about non-attachment, letting go of our attachments to things in the material world. But never did I imagine I would have to let go of my attachment to half my body. And so that was quite an ordeal. I could see letting go of attachment to sort of romantic relationships or attachments to a job or a a food or whatever, but losing half my body was quite a ordeal to overcome. And it was an ongoing thing that I had to decide every day how I was going to approach that experience. And I definitely I had a good attitude on the outside about it pretty much always, but internally there was a lot of why me, why me, why me. And eventually I just kind of learned how to look at it as like, why not me? Like this actually makes sense that I would be chosen for this particular type of ordeal in life because I have the strength both physically and mentally to be able to endure this and actually catalyze it and turn it into value to serve a greater good. And so the more I've done that, the more it's clear why. And I think the why it involves letting go of that false ego. It involves letting go of the expectations of how I thought life was supposed to be, and then seeing, well, what's actually here, and creating my sense of identity not from my expectations, but and my identity and sort of direction not from expectations, but from what's really here, from that sort of higher self perspective, I guess, if you will.
Wow, that's, certainly intense. And I can't imagine going through that. And you make it sound so easy. I love how you reframed it. Why not me? Why can't I create my life now in this different way?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would ask, but how do you work with or push through the fear? How do you work with the devastation that I'm sure you had? How do you then keep working with that on a daily basis
Yeah.
to stay the course?
Well, yeah, and the fact that I make it look easy, just like Tony Hawk makes skateboarding look easy, is
Yes.
is all just a matter of showing up and practicing and practicing and practicing on a daily basis. And when I say practicing, it's really practicing an attitude, practicing a mindset, and and I would say that there's no way out of the devastation. There's only a way through the devastation. And for me, the fear and all of that has come from, like, dealing with all of that has been a byproduct of just really learning how to give myself the freedom to feel and not be in resistance to feeling. And I think that that's the key component. I think that when we resist feeling, we numb ourselves to our situations, and we try to navigate around situations, skirt around things. I mean, if you think about resistance to feeling, there's so many ways in which we can resist feeling. Addiction is the most common way of resisting feeling. Food addictions, porn addictions, um, TV addictions, social media addictions, all of those things are sort of ways to resist actually feeling that sense of loss or the sense of disconnection within. And one doesn't have to be paraplegic to have that resistance to feeling what is. And so I think that's life's greatest challenge, is fully embracing what is.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. It's what I love about the work I do in the deaf world is when people are approaching the end of life, they're more open a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, to get into that depth of feeling, and they come to know themselves as in such an intimate way.
I'm so
Um,
curious about your experience with that. How what that looks like. Yeah, tell me more about that process and how that is it is there are there common sort of elements for, or is it as different as the people involved?
yeah, as different as the people involved. I got into it because I had two step parents who died within close time proximity of each other, and they were very different deaths. One was sudden and unexpected, and the other was drawn out and fully expected, and both were very traumatic for their own reasons, and mostly because of the way that we approach death or don't in this country, the lack of education and the lack of familiarity and comfort even with it, knowledge about it. And so at that point I just thought there's got to be another way to do this. We shouldn't have to die like this, which was just kind of that hushed. My stepmom's doctor would not even tell us that she was dying, and she was so clearly dying, and we knew she was dying, and we would say, but she's dying, and he wouldn't validate it. And so
Wow.
um, it was just such a traumatic experience.
Wow.
So I found that there was this end of life doula role that had kind of grown in prominence over the last 20 or so years. That was kind of like a sister brother role to hospice, where hospice is very focused on all the medical aspects of dying, and the end of life doula role is very focused on the emotional support. Um, and so it can be lots of different things. It can be helping people to connect deeper with themselves at the end, to alleviate fear and be more fulfilled on their way out. It can be just a space holding. It
Mm.
can be helping them plan into those last days when they're not conscious anymore, but they want to have things a very specific way. You can help advocate for what their surroundings are like at that point. Helping with after death is one of the things that I'm really passionate about, bringing back some ceremony and ritual to post death, and not being afraid to celebrate and be with somebody after they've died, and really take the time to say a proper goodbye and that kind of thing. So
Mm.
um, I think, at that point, often you have no reason not to be open and vulnerable and more connected to yourself and the people around you. And so bringing that also to people who are living and want to go there now is something else that I'm passionate about. And it's what you're saying. It's when you connect that deeply to your emotion, your feelings, your wants, your desires, your regrets, all the things, your life is so much more enriched. It has so much more depth, and we're only here for so much time. Why would you not want to spend your time as deeply with as much breath as possible?
Yeah, yeah. I have this sort of theory that our bodies are constantly giving us the the indications energetically that, like, the cellular memory, that they will not last forever, that there's always that message in any given time that is being communicated. We know that our bodies will not last forever, and yet there's the awareness, there's the consciousness, there's the consciousness of that that is sensing that. And and my theory is that that a big part of the conflict that we experience as human beings originates, emerges from that feeling of the body going, I'm not going to be here forever, my time is limited. And the consciousness going, well, what do I do about that? What do I do about that? What do I do about that? And I think that we can see this showing up not only in the fear of actual physical death, but down to moment by moment by moment, with the actions that we choose to take and the behaviors that we have in the moment are either sort of in resistance to that unknown. I think more often are in resistance to that unknown versus embracing the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a child, like we were talking about earlier in the conversation, that child, like when we're in that youthful state of presence, it's because it feels like it's because our bodies have not yet started to generate that signal of our time here is limited, our time here is limited, our time here is limited. So it's just nothing but life, nothing but emerging life all the time. And then, but the more our bodies start to show that aging energy and say, hey, my time here is limited, the more the consciousness can't really deal with that. It's like, well, what do I do to protect myself from that unknown state? Do I need to numb myself through addiction or whatever, find some mechanism to change my neurochemistry so that I don't have to feel that sense of the unknown, that lingering unknown?
Yeah, we don't do very well with uncertainty and the unknown. And our culture programs us to keep aging and death at bay around every turn. So, from the beauty and health industry to the death industry itself, and the way that people are preserved for a traditional funeral after death to look like they're alive and still sleeping, we push it as far away as possible. So that lack of familiarity is in direct conflict with that feeling that you noted internally that says, you don't have that much time. Do it now. Say the thing. Take the job. Quit the job. Change your friendships. Move across the country. Whatever it is, there's no way in our bodies to rectify that.
Yeah, yeah. It's that constant conflict between the known and the unknown that seems to be either people let the unknown freak them out and paralyze them in their tracks, or they somehow work with it. And I've often said that my own physical paralysis isn't really paralysis. If you really think about it, it's really because paralysis, it really indicates a stopping of movement. Now, on the one hand, on one level, yes, there's a stopping of movement in my lower body, but really on a larger level, that's simply an inconvenience.
Mm-hmm.
There's the only thing that can stop movement is perception. So my perception doesn't stop moving. My perception keeps on moving through life. It keeps on evolving. But if I identify with my paralysis, then my psyche will also stop moving. And one of the things that I've had to do with moving through the trauma of the paralysis is to separate psyche from the temporary physical situation. Well, I say temporary, it will most likely last my entire life, but temporary in the greater whole of my soul's evolution. Temporary, and this life is just one manifestation of, zillions,
Mm-hmm.
infinite lifetimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so my consciousness will continue moving, and it is continuing to move. And right now, this particular body that it's in has a particular function that is inconvenient relative to the way that other bodies move. But even that, it's all relative. So I think there's this relationship of relativity that we establish as we navigate the world too. Like, you're able-bodied, I'm not as able-bodied. What does that mean? And the psyche tries to create a story and a narrative around that to try to fit into a known reality versus just saying, well, that's just a thing. I don't need to know anything about it. I can just be with it in the unknown and therefore transcend that dualistic kind of prison that the logical mind likes to create.
Oh my gosh, I can assume, or yeah, well, I've been in this place, that what you just said is probably the scariest part for people. Just especially as you work with clients, asking folks to just hold space for what is instead of trying to build a construct around it or build a story, and just being with it. That like gives me such anxiety just thinking about that concept. And I've definitely been in that space. How do you work with people when they bring you that conflict of what they know to be true in their bodies and what they've constructed in their mind that's keeping them from living, as you like to say, the fuck yes life?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. That's an excellent question. I would say it's different for everyone that I work with. There's a different way in, I would say. But what is common is that we need to start to work with the activity of the nervous system to be able to slow down the activity of the mind in order for the person to become more present to their own unconscious patterns and behaviors. And that I always do through breath. Breath is the critical component to gaining greater access to one's parasympathetic nervous system. And what we don't realize is that so much of our lives are lived in reactivity. And when we are experiencing stress in life, it's because we're in a fight or flight mode almost all the time, living day to day in some kind of fight, flight, or freeze mode.
Mm-hmm.
And people can learn to work with that fight, flight, or freeze and be functional in society just the way that someone can be a functioning alcoholic. But it's not actually the most optimal state of being. You don't want to, just like you don't want to be a functioning alcoholic, ideally, you don't want to be a functional reactive either. And you cannot be saying fuck yes to life if you are in a reactive space, because you're constantly in that sympathetic nervous system response. It's constantly, you've learned to operate with stress and even use stress as a motivator versus and this is so common in our culture, people using stress as a motivator, or taxing the adrenal glands by using coffee to stimulate the adrenal glands. Nothing wrong with coffee, but if it's used in an addictive manner, that means we're actually stressing our systems in order to motivate us. Mm-hmm. And so all of that takes us away from the calm, peaceful stillness of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for everything from digestion to the beating of our heart, to the opening and closing of our vessels, to all of these things are parasympathetic nervous system activity. And when you are consciously breathing and you activate the vagus nerve, then you can start to settle into the present moment more and be in less of a reactive state. And from that neutral space, one can actually begin to examine one's own habits and behaviors without immediately being in some reaction, without immediately sort of kind of constructing another story or denying the experience or whatever. Just being present with the fact that we are creating something, and that what we are creating is not of our own volition, that it is happening to us because of how we've learned to think and show up in the world from our families and our culture, etc. But it's actually very little of it is intentional. And so once we start to connect the breath in and connect the present moment awareness to the breath, then you can actually start to connect to true conscious intention, which is that act of creation that you were just speaking of. And from there, then you actually have access to your fuck yes. Then you have access to, yeah, I want to create from this space. This feels good, because it's not coming from something that I learned and imprinted unconsciously. It's coming from a genuine place of inspiration. And when you think about the term inspire, it means two things. It means breathing, and it means that moment of the aha moment. And so the inspiration, interestingly enough, happens through, it means in spirit, it's happening through the breath. And I had a moment, an unforgettable moment, a week after my accident happened, when the doctors took me off morphine, and I suddenly had the panic attack of all panic attacks. And the only thing I could think of to do lying alone in that bed at night was just to breathe deeply. And I had a complete separation from my body and from my ego, and realized that who I am, what my consciousness actually is pure spirit and pure breath. Mm. And ever since then, I've had such a focus on bringing breath in to, it was so simple and obvious in that moment, but it's so elusive because it happens automatically. Mm-hmm. And we have to pay attention to it in order to start to experience that on a moment by moment basis.
Gosh, I love everything that you just said. And a couple things strike me. One is that I think some people could hear your words a few minutes ago where you said, realizing that this is happening to me, and they could take that as a way to victimize yourself, but it's actually a way to find power in your choice, right? It's when you realize, oh, I created this. That means I can create something different. That there's so much power in that realization. And once you know that, you can't unknow that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's the way I explain it is, we are in any moment where we are creating something that is either unconscious or conscious. And most of what we are creating, unless we learn how to slow down and observe our own mental activity, we will be creating primarily from the unconscious. We will still be creating, we just won't know that we're creating what we're creating. And until we slow down and observe that, then the aha is, oh, I can see that I'm already creating unconsciously. Now let me actually see what I want to create with intention versus in creating from the unconscious. And the two are very different directions, because one is just going to repeat patterns that we aren't even aware that we're creating. And one is going to go, hey, I'm actually the one drawing here. And so I'm going to draw something new. I'm going to create an entirely new picture here.
Yeah. I remember that moment, one of them for myself. I was in a particularly toxic relationship, and I was standing at my kitchen counter and feeling very victimized. And then I can only call it, a download from the universe, a gift from my higher self. I had that moment of, wait a minute, I chose this. That means I can choose something else. I don't have to do this. It's all me. And I think some people would probably feel pressured by that. Like, oh, it's all you. It is, your life is all you. But in that moment, I felt free, knowing I could make the choice and create whatever it was. And can never unknow that. So even in the hard moments now, there's always that space that there's a choice. And largely connected to a lot of the practices like breath work, which I've also had conversations with people where they've said, breath work, what, I breathe all the time, I don't need to understand how to do breath work. But once you learn how to harness the power of the breath, and it is in many cases like yours in your hospital bed, instinctual, your body knows what to do with that, your emotional body knows how to utilize that. But really understanding how to use it consciously is such a valuable way to center yourself and create that space you were noting, so that you can just watch those things go by in your mind without having to grasp onto them or bite the hook.
Yes, yes, well said. Yeah, I feel like breath work, and I think we're going to see this more and more in the emerging science of psychedelic medicines as well, is giving us a preview into death. It's giving us helping to break through, shatter through the logical mind's interpretation of what death is, and open us into a new reality, a new awareness, because we can't possibly, from a logical standpoint, we can't possibly imagine the transcendent. We can't possibly imagine death. It's impossible for the limits of the mind, which operates in duality and logic, to think of something. If you think about it, it's really funny, because death is inherently going into the unknown, and yet our minds seek to make the unknown known. So I've often thought, in terms of the fear of death, I'm fearing something that doesn't exist, because because it's actually, if you think about it, death is non-existence. So if I am fearing death, then I'm fearing something that doesn't exist, because it is non-existence. And so it's really, you can get caught in that mental loop. But how much does that impact our day-to-day lives in a horrible way, whether you are consciously preparing for death or not? In any given moment, there's that type of life-death relationship that's happening between the known and the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that speaks to exactly what we're talking about. If we can free ourselves, and we can see that in any given moment, there is actually a life and death occurrence that is occurring simultaneously right now. You and I are not the same beings that we were when we started this conversation, or even that we were 5 minutes ago. We continue to update, we continue to go through a birthing and death process in any given moment. When one can actually have an embodied experience of that, then that's pretty cool. That's what I think is true freedom.
Yeah, that's the most rad concept of them all, for sure. And then how much easier is it to make the choice to kill the things that don't serve us in this life, right?
That's right.
When we're that much more comfortable with the concept of death itself, and we realize that we actually do have the choice, then it becomes a lot easier to shift our lives in the direction where we actually want them to go, for the most fulfillment and the most peace and the most authentic existence that we can create for ourselves.
Wisely said, wisely said. So I think we just answered that bit about, how do you work with this this phenomenon in pragmatic terms. And I think it's all about exactly this, restoring agency. If it's really about restoring agency to our own consciousness, and not letting the clutter and the chatter of the mind and the fears get in the way. Because what are we actually fearing? Well, we're fearing something that doesn't exist. Okay, once we can wrap our minds and hearts around that, then we can be with the sensations that might pop up, that might still arise, without taking them too seriously or putting too much of our attention on them.
Yes, I love that. I love that. In the last few minutes before we end, I would love to touch on the psychedelic topic for a moment. It's one
Yeah.
that I'm passionate about, especially at the end of life, but also but through death to connect us more deeply to ourselves. And certainly there's a lot of ways to do that, right? Meditation, breath work, acupressure, acupuncture, a million ways. But, the work with psychedelics kind of takes you there a little bit faster.
Psychedelics are a pretty reliable way to get there. Mm-hmm.
Yes, they never let you down. That is for
That's
sure.
right.
Have you had experiences that have been valuable for you?
Many,
Yeah.
many. In fact, when people, comment on my resiliency from my injury, et cetera, all of that, a lot of that is I can attribute to my psychedelic experiences that were, for me, they were very early on in my life. I started to explore psychedelics when I was, I think, 17, and so I was still very much in my developing years, and I had a lot of profound experiences, very, very profound. I did not know myself as a spiritual being prior to those experiences, and those catalyzed quite a lot, quite a lot. And I saw very vividly the way in which, just like we were just speaking of, we are unconsciously creating the worlds that we are living in by whatever activity the mind is engaged with. And that became clear as day, both in myself personally and observing people both with psychedelics, on psychedelics or not, and seeing the way. And I mean, it just shined a light on it. I was like, whoa, this is so obvious right now, how we are creating these. I mean, it's so elusive when we are in our normal habitual day-to-day state of showing up in the world. But when those under the influence of psychedelics, it is so incredibly obvious. It's like looking through a microscope into human consciousness. And so I very much value those experiences. And I think that those experiences really they have shaped me in undeniable ways. I don't use psychedelics very often these days, and when I do, it's generally just privately for my own exploration with a blindfold, just going through my own therapeutic process, or just sort of updating in some way. Um, but I continue to value those experiences, and my hope, my wish is that as psychedelics gain more mainstream acceptance, that it can be done so in a way that it is integrated. There's a soft integration into culture where we can learn how to use them responsibly, because they really are so powerful, and they can be used both for the most transcendent experiences, and they can be absolutely terrifying if used incorrectly. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm 100% with you. I just the benefits that are possible for things like PTSD, anxiety, and depression alone, let alone the million other benefits that they have, are, kind of unmatched. So I'm hoping to see as well that progression into everyday society in the safest, way possible. Um,
Absolutely. Amen.
I my experiences have been, I can think about unmasking fears and showing connectedness to the universe, all that is, um, myself, love in general, really looking into the depths of my heart and unearthing what I've been afraid to look at in everyday life. But in a way that is completely in service to myself and my own evolution. I've certainly had a couple terrifying experiences as well, but not because the experience itself was unsafe or not, I guess, executed in the right way. More because what I was really looking at was a lot of the fears that I had not been looking at.
Uh-huh.
And so it is really important to have a container for that work that that you feel good about, safe within, that you're supported. I would want people who want to try this, for the first time to really think about that. Surround
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would just, yes, I'm really glad that you're putting voice to that. And I would say also to those who are listening who are interested in this possibility, who may not have any experience with psychedelics, even the experienced psychonauts, if you will, psychedelic explorers such as you and I, even even we can experience moments that are very, very uncomfortable
Mhm.
in these states, even coming from a place of having worked a lot with fear and worked a lot with anxiety and that type of thing. Even we can, I every time I have a psychedelic experience, say on psilocybin, I know that a lot of it's going to be uncomfortable,
Mhm.
but I embrace that because it's on the other side of the discomfort. It's something I want to examine. It's like I'll go into it intentionally. I describe it as it might sound kind of crude, but it can be almost like a psychic bowel movement in a way.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's like
totally.
you're clearing something out of your psyche, and it's not always comfortable when you're sitting on the psychic toilet and you're getting rid of some sort of thought-based toxin, that your identity-based toxin that you've been holding on to, that is something that needs to be let go of. But when you see it vividly from that perspective, it can be like you're taking a dump and you're kind of like, oh God, like I don't want anyone to see that, and for me, that's part of why I like to use them privately, because it's like I like to close the door when I go to the bathroom and I like to be alone when I use psychedelics.
And just like that experience feels so good when you're done.
Exactly, exactly. There's a real lightness that comes about when you're done.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Aw, this is such a great conversation. I could keep talking to you for hours, and perhaps we'll do this again. But
Yeah.
for now, we should probably wrap things up. So I would love to thank you for being here today.
Okay, Kristen, it's been my pleasure.
And please tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is zenwarriortraining.com, or you can follow me on Instagram, which is at Zen Warrior Training, facebook.com/Zen Warrior Training. So you can find me, Sam Morris, Zen Warrior Training. Google it, you'll find all those resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen. This has been a really fun conversation.
It really has.